Hey, I'm Duke on Twitch. If you want to support the channel and greensunzenith.com, you can find my Patreon, merch store, and singles store where you can buy singles through TCG Player or Card Hoarder in the video description. If you want to get in contact, you can also find all that info in the description below for things like donation deck lists or just wanting to reach out. Alright, let's get right into it. Hey, welcome back to Dukes on Twitch. Back today with a deck tech on a new version of Abzan Maverick I want to work on. So this is generally pretty straightforward in how Mav tends to attack the metagame in regards to Abzan colors. But some of the big cards here that you'll note are Once Upon a Time, Spirit of the Labyrinth, and Endurance. I would say these are the biggest additions to the main deck. Some for consistency, some for combo hate, some for just generally being a strong card like Endurance. And for this specific build, I've kind of broken it up. So we have our utility lands, we have our mana, we have our sort of consistency and tutor ability, we have our combo hate and protection, and then we have our removal. So this was something where I had a 10-10-10 idea. But as you can see, I've kind of moved Ramanap into the consistency / tutor ability, and I've also moved in the two utility lands in Boseiju and Maze here. Boseiju and Maze really nice in this version because it means we can find pseudo removal through Once Upon a Time. You might have seen versions in the past with Skyclave Apparition, which of course is a creature you can find with once that is removal. And luckily in this version you can also find Grist with once, which is pretty sweet. But I wanted to make sure that this deck, although having a bunch of answers, it has a bunch of answers to the right things. And I think right now that Endurance is in a really good spot. I think Endurance is a great way to fight against Blue-Red Delver, especially for a green deck, and especially for a green deck that runs Green Suns, because by having 3 copies, we essentially have 8, or 7, thanks to Green Sun Zenith. Just like Knight, it is a 3-drop. It has an impact straight away, which is really nice, by most likely removing your opponent's graveyard from the field. It also just gives you a little bit of a boost in game 1 against decks like Ouphe spells or Reanimator that heavily rely on the graveyard. And against some of the slower control decks, I just don't mind it as a 3/4 flash creature. It can be super relevant there as just a way to keep beating down and getting some momentum going after something like a Terminus or a Supreme Verdict, or your opponent's, prismatic ending your main threat and then pass turn. But it has come at a cost. I'm running the 3 Endurance here and a few other cards by cutting Knight of the Reliquary down to just a 2 of in the deck, which for me has been a shift that I've wanted to try out in a while. I think Maverick for a long time has had some sacred cows like Gaddock Teeg, Scavenging Ooze, another Reliquary, that although very powerful in the right metagame, I think that right now Knight doesn't have the impact that I want from it as a 4 of. And I feel like for the matchups where Knight is relevant, say Cloudpost or lands, still having 2 copies or 6 with Green Suns is more than enough to make sure that I don't lose too many percentage points in those matchups by having 2 less of a copies. And of course, Green Suns only gets better as it scales. So having the ability to use those 2 slots for something like Endurance is really strong in my eyes. It allows us to have a lot more game against decks where the increase in matchup percentages far outweighs the decrease in the sort of favored matchups where Knight is typically a big strength. So this version is running Once Upon a Time, which is a pretty awesome card in a deck that can use both its sides. We have really powerful lands and we have really powerful creatures. We have great 1-drops that it can grab, and in the late game it can also just make sure we're grabbing some sort of threat to put onto the board. To cut room for these, I removed a land, a Mother of Runes, and a Mana Dork. I believe I was running a 3-2 split of Noble Hierarchs and Birds of Paradise. But I think the 4-4 split is fine, or the 2-2 split to make 4 of 2 birds and 2 nobles. Bird's pretty relevant, being a flyer. It can produce red, which is nice for things like Prismatic Ending to get above that 3 curve. It also has some small advantages, like being able to return a Trained Lightning with either Double Bird or Bird and Scrib Ranger. It can just be a fog for a turn against a Murktide. Obviously, with Mother of Runes, it can also just be a way to keep a Murktide from attacking. The downside is plays where you might be on the draw against a Teferi deck, and a turn 1 Noble into turn 2 threat means that if your opponent plays a turn 3 Teferi and bounces your threat, you still have a creature that can attack and kill the Teferi Noble Hierarch. Birds of Paradise can't do that, and that's probably the big moments where I really wish I do have a Noble in play, is when my opponent plays a Planeswalker and reduces it down to 1, and don't have that ability to deal with it. But 4 has been fine. This deck does run a lot of 3-drops, so having that turn 1 acceleration is pretty key. But with Dryad Arbor, the Once Upon a Times, the Birds and the Nobles, I think it's still at a pretty good level. I am still running a Sylvan Library in this deck, even though it plays a 3-man deck Spirit of Labyrinth. And that's because I think it's a little bit like Gaddock Teeg and Green Suns, whereas against the decks where you want Teeg, or in this case Spirit of Labyrinth, if you have both Spirit and Library in play, you're probably pretty happy. There's also a bit of a headache for your opponents, where if they deal with the Spirit first, then you might actually get an activation of your Library. But if they deal with the Library first, with something like a Prismatic Ending, and then they have to find another way to kill the Spirit, which is actually the real threat. So I do like that. We also have a pretty good chance of that just not happening. It can come up where it is awkward to play something like a Spirit and then draw into your Sylvan Library, but I think otherwise it's pretty strong. And Library's really good for Maverick in the matchups where your opponent might not have a lot of reach, and allow you to be pretty aggressive with it. Against something like Depths, or Infect, of course, which doesn't see too much play now, but there's definitely a few decks out there where it doesn't really matter if you're at 20 life or 4 life. It's more about just getting that card advantage and being ahead of your opponent. Even some of the slower Bant decks can't really keep up with Library unless they find a quick answer to it or land something like a Narset. Ouphe in this deck I think is still really strong. It's kind of what Gaddock Teeg used to do, in that it gave you a Green Suns target that isn't so much an auto win these days, but is very close to an I win button, especially in game 1 against some decks. It really keeps the unfair decks from being able to just combo off on turn 2 or 3 if you are on the play. And of course this deck isn't running anything like a Stoneforge Mystic package, so you aren't being hit by anything, which is really nice. I still think Thalia is pretty good. There was a consideration to go down to 2 with the Once Upon a Times in the deck and then run another bear, but I think a 3-3 split of Spirit and Thalia is pretty nice. There's still a lot of decks that do find Thalia the annoying speed bump that she is, but I do think right now that Spirit just hits a few more decks where it really matters, so I'm always pretty happy to see that. Prismatic Ending and Swords to Plowshares, 3 Ending and 4 Swords I think is a pretty nice way to make sure you're going to see the removal when you want to see it. Blue-Red Delver on their creature starts can be quite hard to beat, because we do have a pretty good way of making sure the ground is protected, but once Delver's creatures start flying, without endurance it can be pretty hard to stop them. So having access to Maze of Ith, Prismatic Ending and Swords to Plowshares is really nice. And then also Grist as a Green Suns target if we really do need to get something off the board. Grist also really nice in the sense that it allows cards like Collector Ouphe actually have a role in every matchup. So Collector Ouphe without Grist against Elves doesn't really do anything, but if you have naturally drawn it and then land a Grist, you can turn that Collector Ouphe into a piece of removal, which is pretty awesome. So that's where I like Grist, in that it allows you to make use of things like extra copies of creatures like Thalia into removal, or just give a creature a role. Another good one is Mother of Runes against a colorless deck, maybe something like an Eldrazi deck. Yeah, Grist's just really strong. And of course, also with Sylvan Library, in the case we get both out, really cool in knowing what you're going to mill as well. The Boseiju is an interesting one. This deck doesn't have a way to put lands into hand other than once and naturally drawing them. Knight can fetch them up, but it puts them into play. Ramanap can get them back, but puts them into play. I don't think it's worth playing anything like Yavimaya, which allows you to return makes all your lands forests, which means with something like Scrib Ranger, you could then return any land, including Boseiju, to your hand. I think that's just a little bit too cute. But yeah, Boseiju just, I think it's powerful enough to have it in the deck with once, and does give you some nice outs to things like main deck Blood Moon, back to basics, maybe like a Jitte or some other sort of relevant piece against a creature-based deck. But all in all, this is a 60 that I'm pretty happy about. There was also a thought of upping the colored sources, so something like an extra verdant for a Wasteland, and just having 3 Wastelands and 3 onces. But without the extra knights, I do like having the full 4 Wastelands to make sure I see this in my opening few turns a little bit more than usual. To the board. So the board is pretty compact. We have 5 sort of creature removal spells. We have 5 pieces of combo hate, and then just some sort of one-ofs in the board that I think are pretty good in this current metagame. So Deafening Silence is probably just the best white card that's been printed in a long time against combo decks, especially as turn 1 interaction. One thing about Deafening Silence is that it does only hit non-creature spells, so unlike Aethersworn Canonist, it does nothing against elves. But what I'm doing is I'm wanting to have turn 1 hate against combo decks, and that is Deafening Silence. So by making the cut of saying, hey, I'm going to be a little bit more open to elves, I'm happy to have this against things like Reanimator, any sort of Tess, Ant, or the Epic Gamble decks. Mindbreak Trap is a newish one and probably a bit of a flex slot. It's currently here to give me some game on turn 0, especially on the draw, against combo decks, especially against any sort of Dark Ritual decks. Even Reanimator is a pretty good one to have Trap in against because of things like Ritual into Entomb and then Reanimate spell, or even Pedal, Faithless Looting, Reanimate spell. It's usually a card that's going to do more than something in the main deck that just isn't going to have the effect you want, like Ramanap. So I do like Trap for combo decks, and just having more game in the early turns to be able to get to turn 2 to land Thalia or Spirit or Collector Ouphe. So pretty big fan there. Force of Vigor, just a really fantastic card, and the flexibility of Force is really strong. That's why I'm a big fan of playing Force of Vigor over a more niche card like Seeds of Innocence, because I want to have answers to things like 8 Mulch, or other decks that play maybe Mox Diamonds and Sylvan Libraries. I want to be able to bring in Force and have a really good, even turn 0 effect against my opponent if needed. Choke has definitely been on the downswing. I think Prismatic Ending is a really strong main deck removal spell, and it obviously has kind of deteriorated the amount of times Choke can have an impact on a game, but there are still times where Choke can just hit your opponent really hard, so I do like having one in the deck, and I think it's a great way for Maverick to attempt to take over the control-ish kind of style against some of those blue decks. I wanted to play a Planeswalker, and I think Kai is pretty strong. Straight away, she comes down, makes your opponent discard, and you draw a card, which is pretty nice. There is, again, some dyssynergy with Spirit of Labyrinth, but I think that's more than fine, and I don't think it will come up as much as you might think. The Exile ability is really cool because it just kills construct tokens, which is fantastic. It allows me to reset something like an Endurance, a Plague Engineer, or a Knight of Autumn, which is nice, or even just take out a big threat of theirs. If it's coming in against some of the more mid-range Murktide decks, being able to actually take the counters off Murktide is pretty strong here. And all in all, just a really good, solid Planeswalker. It's hard sometimes to find a walker that can produce that value straight away that replaces itself, but I'm pretty happy with Kaya. Tower, another flex, and really here for Kaldra. I found Kaldra pretty hard. We do have Prismatic Ending for the Germ, but there's a lot of flicker effects out of things like Maverick, out of things like Death and Taxes. So having access to Tower is pretty nice. It really shores up any sort of artifact deck, where a Stoneforge Mystic backed by Force of Will into Kaldra can be really hard to keep up with, and really forces you to find those Prismatic Endings early on. Another great reason to have Maze of Ith in the deck is that it does answer Kaldra quite nicely. Tower, of course, is tech you see a lot more in Naya Depths to get through things like Thopter tokens, but I think that's more of just a nice added bonus for Maverick. There's probably not going to be too many times against something like 8cast where it's going to be tower that allows me to get knight through, you know, a bunch of Thopters to get in for 10 or 11. So pretty keen to see how much the tower comes up, because I think it's, yeah, just one of those kind of flex slots where I want to try it out, see how it goes, and if it doesn't have the impact that I want, then we get another slot to play around with, which is pretty cool. Path over something like Abrupt Decay or Council's Judgment is just for Murktide, having a nice cheap threat. A little bit awkward in the early game against something like Elves or, apologies, Green Sun Zenith decks, also Death and Taxes, but again, it's just really unconditional removal, in the sense that it can hit anything from Delver to DRC to Murktide, and that's what I really want, just nice cheap removal for these blue-red decks. And then Plague. Plague is just a nice way to deal with decks like Goblins, Elves, and Death and Taxes at times, but a lot of their bodies are becoming X2s, so Plague not as much of a lights out card against D&T than it used to be. But it is nice, you know, it takes a bit of pressure off having to have that turn 1 interaction against a Mother of Runes, and just gives us, yeah, a little bit more edge against the decks like D&T that are becoming such value engines that a lot of their cards are doing something. Stoneforge fetches a card, Recruiter fetches a card, Skyclave deals with something, Flickers flickers them all, Urian's coming down, Solitude's going to take out a creature, then be an attacker as well. It can be really tough to keep up with, but I think all in all, Plague is still a pretty good reason to splash black. But I think, again, as I have said for a long time, I think Prismatic Ending is the best reason to splash any colors in Maverick right now. But yeah, that's generally my thoughts on Mav right now. I think I really want to be able to have some really strong games against combo in games 2 and 3, and for me, that's in the form of turn 0 or turn 1 hate, and especially hate that is really strong. Deafening Silence is a must answer. It's definitely not a speed bump for most decks, like something like Thalia. You know, you can still see a lot of opponents combo off through Thalia. Deafening Silence for the decks where I want it, things like Tess and Ant, it's going to be a lot harder. Obviously not as big of a, I guess more so a speed bump against decks like Doomsday and Sneak, but I think as well, it just allows me to buy that time to get something like a Spirit or a Thalia into play. So it's not so much about winning, you know, on turn 0 or 1. It's about allowing myself the time to develop my board on turns 2 and 3, potentially. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I think as the format's been shifting, and obviously growing over the past few years with a few fire design cards, one question that I've been really asking myself is Maverick in a position where we have the luxury to play flexible cards like Force of Vigor, or is Maverick in such a fair position that we have to have real bullets in the board, like Seeds of Innocence, like Deafening Silence, like Leyline of the Void, instead of things that, you know, have a bit of an effect here and there and a bit of flexibility across these 5 matchups. That's a tough one to decide on, and I think it's only going to be playing leagues and playing challenges that will allow me to really understand where Maverick is, how it can sideboard, you know, how much time does it get in the average game? You know, do you have time to set things up, or do you have to kind of lower your curve in hate to be able to control your opponent's ability to win in the early turns? And then value. Value is the other big one. Things like Endurance are really nice because they do have that value straight away. Knight, you typically need to untap. Ramanap, you need to play on turn 4, sometimes turn 3 if I'm at a dork to get a land back. Spirit's nice because straight away it has an impact on the board. Night of Autumn, again, straight away impact on the board. So there are a lot of sort of 1-for-1 trades in this deck, unlike decks like Death and Taxes, so you do have to grind out your wins and play a pretty fair game compared to other fair decks in the format, but I think there's definitely something here. I will say it's tough from a competitive standpoint to not look further into punishing Maverick, or at least green, white, red with Pyroblast effects in the sideboard, because with Pyroblast and a lot of main deck blue-red decks, it's pretty hard to not see how important and relevant it is right now in the current metagame. And it could just be that, you know, a green-white deck with a really solid mana base, and Green Sun's package and removal package with just a red splash for blasts in the sideboard could be the way to go. You know, maybe it's not worth actually putting in the Graves and Punishing Fires. Maybe Clothis is just a little bit of old tech that is not really relevant these days. And it's about kind of playing the same as Green White Depths, where you just have those red blasts in the sideboard. But then it's really, from a competitive standpoint, again, asking yourself, why am I not playing Depths? You know, Depths is putting up all these great finishes. Maverick hasn't for a long time. Is there a real reason why I want to play sort of Naya Maverick over Naya Depths? And I think that question really comes down to you as a player and what you enjoy, because there's definitely times where I enjoy playing Punishing Mav over Punishing Depths or over Naya Depths, because I just want to be able to bash with creatures and, you know, play a little bit more of a Green Suns game. We have that full toolbox of creatures that have an impact on a game, and, you know, being a little bit more proactive about your plays rather than reactive with things like crop rotation. So yeah, a lot of big questions. I think it's pretty cool to see a lot of players doing well in sort of the local leagues or in MTGO leagues with Mav across multiple archetypes. So yeah, definitely want to get back on that board, and I think this is a pretty nice way to get there. If you guys have any questions, definitely let me know in the comments below. If you're not subbed to the page, definitely sub. It's always really nice to see the sub count grow week on week for this YouTube channel. So that's awesome. You can also find my Discord, the Zenith, in the description below, and I'll also have this deck list there, so make sure you find that. But until next time, I'll see you. Cheers.